Puerto Rico has been controlled by some other country. Before the United States took over Puerto Rico, it belonged to Spain. And at one point, it seemed as though Puerto Rico might be granted independence. In 1897, during the Spanish-American War, the Spanish Prime Minister signed the Charter of Autonomy, which granted Puerto Rico the right to its own legislature, constitution, tax policy, borders. Elections for the new legislature were held in March of 1898, and the new government was scheduled for installation in May of 1898. Well, on May 12, 1898, 12 U.S. battleships, destroyers, and torpedo boats bombed the city of San Juan, which is the capital of Puerto Rico, for 3 straight hours. The United States took the newly independent capital of Puerto Rico for 3 straight hours. The United States took the newly independent island by force. Shortly after the U.S. invasion, one of the largest hurricanes in Caribbean history hit Puerto Rico and destroyed thousands of Puerto Rican farms and nearly the entire 1898 coffee bean crop, which devastated the island's economy. And so what did the charity balls and shower our new island with rebuilding funds? No, the United States sent no money. Instead, the following year, the United States outlawed all Puerto Rican currency and declared the island's peso, which at the time was equal to the U.S. dollar, well, we declared the peso to be worth only 60 American cents. And so every Puerto Rican lost 40% of his or her savings overnight. 2 years later, the bankers moved in. In 1901, a colonial land tax known as the Hollander Bill forced many small farmers to mortgage their land with U.S. banks. With no laws regulating the banks on the island, interest defaulted on their loans, the banks foreclosed and took their properties. Now, this is a move that, had we known Puerto Rico's history with our bankers, could have foreshadowed how the bankers would play quote-unquote homeowners in this most recent decade. Because here's a reality that very few people like to acknowledge when they buy a home. You don't own that home until you have paid off every cent you borrowed from the bank. If you can't pay your loan, the bank can and will take your house, which means you don't really own it. The bank does. The genius bankers in the run-up to the financial crash were screwing with people's mortgages, adjustable rate loans. The way these worked is that people went to the bank to get a loan for a house, and they saw their monthly payments at first were amazingly low. They could afford it. But in the fine print that people didn't read or understand, after a few months or years, the bank would jack up the interest rate so high that people couldn't afford their monthly payments anymore, just like they did to the landowners in Puerto Rico. And then the banks took people's homes. Those same banks and investors gobbled up properties and converted them to rentals, now ensuring that banks get to profit from our housing whether we rent or buy. But back to Puerto Rico. After the U.S. found their own land from the banks, who then stole the properties via high interest rates, the U.S. banking interests dedicated 45% of all farmable land in Puerto Rico to just one crop, sugar. And there was one person in particular who was largely responsible for this happening. The very first governor who was appointed by the U.S. president to run Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen. He used his brief time in office to create a sugar empire all for himself. First, Charles Herbert Allen created a budget for the entire island. He raised property taxes, withheld loans from Puerto Rican farmers, and froze all building, repair, and school construction funds. He then redirected this money to subsidize U.S. farms on the islands. He issued contracts to his favored U.S. businessmen with no competition at all, and then directed roads to be built by agents from his father's Massachusetts lumber business at double the cost. As for the Puerto Ricans, their new role in their country would be labor, cheap labor, for the U.S.-owned sugar companies. And Governor wrote, quote, "With American capital and American energies, the labor of the natives can be utilized to the lasting benefit of all parties," unquote. A few weeks after turning in this report, on September 15, 1901, Allen resigned as governor. He then headed straight to Wall Street, where he became a high-ranking official, so quickly installed himself as treasurer and then president of the largest sugar refining company in the world, the American Sugar Refining Company, which is now known as Domino Sugar. You can find their product on a shelf near you. From his new position, ex-Governor Charles Herbert Allen turned the company into the largest sugar company in the world, based off of the labor of the Puerto Rican people. He pulled this off with the help of the people he had appointed to government in Puerto Rico, who provided him with land grants, tax subsidies, water rights, railroad easements, foreclosure sales, and favorable tax policies. Our relationship with Puerto Rico got off to a very corporatist start. And In the middle of Puerto Rico's transition into a giant sugar plantation, the U.S. Congress passed the Jones-Shafroth Act, which authorized a Puerto Rican Bill of Rights in Congress, an elected resident commissioner to the United States Congress, and immediate U.S. citizenship for all Puerto Ricans. Which sounds nice and all, except for the fact that this law had some flaws. First of all, the U.S. Congress could ignore any Puerto Rican Bill of Rights. Second, the U.S. Congress could override any laws passed by the Puerto Rican Congress. Third, the resident commissioner had no vote in the U.S. Congress. And fourth, U.S. citizenship was a vehicle for drafting Puerto Rican men into the U.S. military to fight in World War I. We know this because exactly 1 month after the passage of the Jones-Shafroth Act, President Woodrow Wilson presented his declaration of war against Germany before the U.S. Congress. Then on June 27, 1917, Wilson ordered the registration and recruitment of the male inhabitants of Puerto Rico between the ages of 21 and 31. 20,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted and fought for the United States in World War I. 100 years later, they still can't vote for their own commander-in-chief. So obviously that's unfair, but the law that has been financially f***ing Puerto Rico the longest and the hardest is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, also known as the Jones Act. Because of this law, all goods, all of them, carried by boat to the island between U.S. ports must be on ships that are owned by U.S. companies and that are constructed in the United States. So they have to be owned by U.S. citizens and operated by U.S. citizens. Every cruiser leaves Puerto Rico must be carried on a U.S. ship, a giant favor to the U.S. shipping companies. And because it is an island in the ocean, obviously Puerto Rico relies heavily on ships to bring goods to and from the U.S. mainland. Cars, building materials, food, fossil fuels, because right now 67% of Puerto Rico's electricity is generated by burning petroleum. Everything that Puerto Ricans need must be offloaded from the original carrier, reloaded onto U.S. ship, and then be delivered to Puerto Rico in order to comply with the Jones Act. And obviously, moving all of this shit around the different boats, that adds costs to the prices of just about everything that's sold in Puerto Rico. Now, there is one major exception, which is that a foreign flagged vessel may enter directly into Puerto Rico, but only after paying really high taxes, customs, and carry. Now, it would be one thing if these taxes were benefiting Puerto Rico, but they're not, because all of these import fees that are levied on foreign ships are paid to the U.S. Merchant Marines, which is part of the federal government, and not the Puerto Rican Treasury. Big profits are generated for U.S. shipping companies, and it increases revenues for the U.S. federal island pay more for almost everything they buy that they can't produce themselves. How is that fair? And this is something that people in Congress are aware of, because repealing the Jones Act is an idea that's been kicked around in Congress. In fact, John McCain has been pushing for it. And so why hasn't that happened? Well, perhaps it's because shipping companies have political action. Maritime Corporation, which is one of these shipping companies that makes a lot of money shuttling back and forth between the mainland and Puerto Rico. Well, Crowley Maritime Corporation's Political Action Committee handed out $100,000 to 42 members of Congress in the 2016 election and spent $540,000 lobbying them. Also, these companies and many others that benefit from the Jones Act are members of a lobbying organization called the American Maritime Partnership, which has a whole section on their website defending the Jones Act, and which spent $310,000 lobbying specifically on PROMESA, which is the law that created the Fiscal Control Board. Could have repealed the Jones Act to help Puerto Rico, but it didn't. Do you think that $310,000 could have possibly had anything to do with it? When I was in Puerto Rico, I asked a few people who I had, decent, long enough conversations with, a few bartenders and Uber drivers, what they thought would help Puerto Rico's situation, specifically the island's $72 billion debt. And getting rid of the Jones Act came up more than once. There appears to be a lot of awareness by people who live there that the Jones Act is a large cause of their debt and personal struggles to afford life on the island. And the official numbers back that up. From 1970 to 2010, the Jones Act cost Puerto Rico's government $29 billion. If you project that from 1920, when the law was passed, until the present, this cost becomes $75.8 billion, which is an amount that is higher than Puerto Rico's current $72 billion public debt. In other words, if Puerto Rico's current $72 billion public debt. In other words, if the Jones Act didn't exist, then possibly neither would the public debt of Puerto Rico. Around the same time as the passage of the Jones Act, the U.S. Supreme Court declared Puerto Rico a territory, not a state, and ruled that the U.S. Constitution did not apply there. And so in the island, the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. And so Charles Herbert Allen, the Sugar King, well, him and all of his other sugar plantation managers, they got their cheap labor. And as you might expect, the Puerto Ricans weren't thrilled about being denied civil rights that are granted to every other American citizen. A little over 10 years after every other American citizen. A little over 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution didn't apply to the citizens in Puerto Rico, the governor of Puerto Rico, who had been appointed by FDR, was Robert Hayes Gore. And proving that our campaign system based on legal bribery is not new, Gore had given $10,000 to Democratic Party bribery is not new. Gore had given $10,000 to Democratic Party leaders and supported FDR's presidential bid through his newspapers. In exchange, in August 1933, he received the appointment as Puerto Rico's governor. Now, this guy was a brilliant businessman, but he was a governor. He didn't know anything about governing, and he wasn't even sure where Puerto Rico businessman governor who bought his way into office was in charge when an agricultural strike broke out in November of 1933. Governor Big Business was incapable of slowing it down. And by January of 1934, it had spread throughout the entire island. The Nationalist Party led the strike, and their strike paralyzed the island's sugar economy for an entire depression worsened. The U.S. banks that controlled Puerto Rico's sugar plantations cut wages all over the island. Sugarcane workers who had gotten 75 cents for a 12-hour day in 1929 were down to 45 cents in 1933. And by January of 1934, the workers of Puerto Rico's entire sugar industry were refusing to work until their wages increased. And this freaked out Puerto Rican people. Together, the corporate titans contacted President Roosevelt and told him that, quote, a state of actual anarchy exists. Towns in a state of siege, police impotent, business paralyzed, unquote. And so finally, on February 23rd, 1934, the sugar strike was settled. The workers would receive $1.50 for a 12-hour day, double the 75 cents per day they had gotten before. The national strike was a huge success, and it increased the paychecks of the corporate wage slaves all over Puerto Rico. Now, I just want to take a minute here and acknowledge something that happened since I recorded the last episode here in modern time that I know a lot of you noticed I did not support via my comments on Twitter. And I'm talking about the Day Without a Woman. For those of you who are unaware or have already forgotten it, the same people who organized the Women's March on Washington to protest the election of Donald Trump organized a national labor strike for, well, that's the thing. I don't know. The website said that it was a, quote, one-day demonstration of economic solidarity, unquote, which, what the fuck is that? That's not a demand. Now let's compare that to what was done in Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans had an actual demand. They wanted their wages restored and they stopped working. And when they achieved their goal, they went back to work. Puerto Ricans harnessed their power as workers, because they knew that if they didn't show up, the sugar didn't get processed, it didn't get packaged, it didn't get sold, and it didn't get profited from. And since the only thing a corporation cares about is money, the Puerto Ricans hit the corporations where it hurt, their profit margins, in order to get their fair treatment. And that is so different from what went on March 8th. There was no demand. And there was even an announced end date the next day. What was the point of that? Labor strikes, especially national ones, are a powerful tool that are not to be toyed with like that. We might need to do a real strike one day. In fact, one day soon, now that we have a walking, talking multinational corporation as president, now that he's appointed corporate CEOs to be in charge of law enforcement, and now that we have a Congress made up of the same exact people that we've been watching make laws for corporate interests for years. If you're going to wield your power as a worker in this corporate system, don't waste it. Protesting is not a game, because as Puerto Rico's history shows us, there were very real, very scary repercussions for the people that led that strike. Because as word of it spread throughout Washington and Wall Street, a message was sent back to the U.S. installed leaders in Puerto Rico. The message was that the Nationalist Party that led that strike must be stopped by any means necessary. And here's how the United States stopped the Nationalist Party, a party made up of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico. So to restore law and order, President Roosevelt appointed a new governor, General Blanton Winship, a retired Army general from Georgia who proceeded to militarize the entire island. He created new police training camps and new U.S. military bases. He also added hundreds of men to the police force, a lot like how the local police here on the mainland have been getting military equipment for at least the last 10 years. Now, the police chief at the time in Puerto Rico was Colonel E. Francis Riggs, who had worked in the military intelligence department for the U.S. federal government and who was also the heir to the Riggs National Bank fortune. Riggs National Bank headquarters presidents or their families had banked at Riggs, and the bank specialized in private international banking for rich people. Throughout Central America, Riggs National Bank was suspected of laundering money for right-wing dictators, bribing entire Congresses, and participating in regime changes by financing military coups disguised as revolutions on behalf of the United States. And this is not ancient history. More recently, Riggs National Bank was caught laundering money for Augusto Pinochet, the U.S. coup-installed war crime-committing, torturing dictator of Chile, and the bank was sold in 2004. So, basically, a friend of dictators was the police chief of Puerto Rico and was told by the U.S. corporate titans to stop the Nationalist Party. On October 24th, 1935, University of Puerto Rico students were holding a meeting, to discuss their relationship with the Nationalist Party. The police surrounded the campus and stationed themselves on every street corner with tear gas and machine guns. A squad of officers surrounded them, started shooting. When the shooting stopped, 3 nationalists and a bystander were dead. 4 days later, Police Chief Riggs told several major newspapers that he was ready to, quote, wage war to the death against all Puerto Ricans, unquote. A few months later, on February 23, 1936, Police Chief Riggs was assassinated by two Puerto Ricans. The assassins were executed by the police within an hour. With his police chief dead, Governor Winship took immediate personal command of the police. Later that evening, the evening of the assassination, 2 more nationalists were shot and killed by the police. And then other nationalists just disappeared and were never heard. And that was only the beginning. During the following weeks, Governor Winship hired more police and instructed them to raid homes and offices, to conduct warrantless searches, to arrest people throughout the island, and to prevent citizens from traveling as they please. Things that are routinely happening to people in the United States right now. Governor Winship also prohibited all public demonstrations, which I'm hoping isn't a foreshadowing of events to come, but clearly we've allowed this to happen to U.S. citizens before. The violence peaked in Puerto Rico on March 21st, 1937, when police killed 17 unarmed U.S. citizens. In 13 minutes, the police used machine guns to break up a peaceful, permitted march on the city of Ponce. They shot men, women, children, anyone in the area, many of them in the back as they ran away. No weapons, none at all, were found in the wounded or the dead. But after the gunshot stopped, perhaps realizing that this could look bad, the police staged photos intended to make it seem like the nationalists were firing upon the police. But the American Civil Liberties Union conducted a 10-day investigation in Ponce and San Juan, and they had 3 findings. First, they found that the facts showed that the affair on March 21st and 2, civil liberties had been repeatedly denied during the previous 9 months by the order of Governor Blanton Winship, who had failed to recognize the rights of free speech and assembly and threatened to use the use of force against anyone who would exercise those rights. 3, the Ponce massacre arose out of the denial by the police of the civil rights of citizens to parade and assemble, and denial ordered by the governor of Puerto Rico. Despite these findings, that this governor had slaughtered U.S. citizens for no reason, there was no police officer that was fired, demoted, suspended, convicted, jailed, or any way punished for what happened. I wanted to see how big of an area we were talking about that the police had closed off and just shot anyone who was in it. It was basically, it all happened on one street corner. And I can tell you that these streets could not fit more than 2 cars. We're talking about a very small area, which helped me understand how 200 people could be shot in such a short amount of time. But there was a museum there that I wanted to go to. And when you look online, it says that it's open from at least Wednesday through Sunday from 8:30 to 4:30. Ryan and I went on a Saturday at noon and it was closed. Now, I'm not going to go and say that this is some big conspiracy budget cuts, but looking online, very few people have reviewed this museum. It's hard to get into. There was no posted hours. There was no phone number. There was nothing. And so in Ponce, they do have a museum that will apparently tell you that this happened if you can get into it. So it's just one of those ways that we have this history into it. So it's just one of those ways that we have this history, but it's being subtly covered up by not allowing people to walk in and understand what happened there. Anyway, shortly after the Ponce massacre, Governor Winship arrested the leader of the Nationalist Party, Pedro Albizu Campos, on charges of trying to overthrow Puerto Rico, despite a lack of evidence that he did anything other than lead a labor strike. After he was acquitted, after the jury said he was not guilty, he was not released. Instead, he was retried and convicted by a rigged jury made up of American Friends of Wall Street, and he had to serve 11 years in prison. And so this is what I mean. Protests are not a game, not when they're real. But anyway, Governor Winship was massacring citizens and locking them up with bullshit trials, and yet was still in office. And the thing that finally got Governor Winship removed from office was a speech delivered by a congressman on the floor of the House of Representatives. Tyrannical acts of the governor in depriving the people of Puerto Rico of their civil rights, unquote. The day after the congressman spoke out against Governor Winship on the floor of the House, FDR replaced him as the governor of Puerto Rico. And immediately after leaving the governor's mansion, Winship became a lobbyist for the U.S. corporations and sugar companies that owned the economy of Puerto Rico. His job was to persuade the U.S. Congress to exempt Puerto Rico from the Fair Labor Standards Act. His job was to have the wage and hour law amended so that the sugar companies could cut their workers' pay in half. Luckily, Winship was defeated. But at this point, I would like to remind you that part of the PROMESA bill that was signed last year was a provision that allows the Fiscal Control Board to lower the minimum wage for people under the age of 25 in Puerto Rico to $4.25 an hour. I just got back from Puerto Rico. Beer prices were pretty cheap, or more than here on the mainland. I know that there is no way I could survive on $4.25 an hour, but Congress is still letting corporations pay Puerto Ricans less than us. So many of the injustices from decades ago are still going on today. But back to the past. Even after that tall general left Puerto Rico's government, things got even more Orwellian. In the 1940s, the police working with the FBI started creating detailed personnel files on over 100,000 Puerto Rican citizens. These profiles were used to create FBI lists, and at the whim of the governor or the FBI director, anyone on the list could be in prison just for being on the list. At the same time, Marin was elected president of the Puerto Rican Senate. A couple years later, in April of 1943, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received multiple reports that Luis Muñoz Marin was a drug addict. In addition, a report showed that he'd been involved in an important narcotics case, but nothing was done because Muñoz Marin would fire all of the members of the Puerto Rican was even considered. Muñoz Marin was a junkie, had gotten caught in a drug deal, and he'd used his public office to bury the entire thing. And this was used to blackmail him. Now, at the time, in the early 1940s, the majority of Puerto Rico's democratically elected representatives officially supported independence. But the day after Muñoz Marin, the president of the Puerto Rican Senate, was told that the FBI knew that he was a corrupt junkie, a senator from Maryland introduced a bill in the U.S. Congress that opened the door for Puerto Rican independence. But even though the majority of the Puerto Rican people wanted it, and Luis Muñoz Marin himself had run on it, Muñoz Marin opposed the independence bill. Then in 1948, acting in his new role of puppet for the U.S. government, Luis Muñoz Marin engineered the passage of Puerto Rico's Public Law 53, also known as the Gag Law. This law authorized the police and FBI to stop anyone on the street and to invade any Puerto Rican home. The law made it a felony to own a street and to invade any Puerto Rican home. The law made it a felony to own or display a Puerto Rican flag, even in your own house, or to speak in favor of Puerto Rican independence. It also made it a felony to print, publish, sell, or exhibit any material that might undermine the government. Shortly afterwards, Puerto Ricans got to elect their own governor for the first time, and for some reason, they picked Luis Muñoz Marin. After he took power, he used Law 53, the gag law, to arrest over 3,000 people without evidence or fair trials and to send some of them to prison for 20 years. Meanwhile, after serving 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, nationalist Pedro Albizu Campos was released and returned to Puerto Rico. And long story short, when he returned to Puerto Rico, where he was under 24-hour-a-day surveillance by the FBI, he discovered that his friends were being captured and tortured in a prison called La Princesa that was literally in the shadow of the governor's mansion. He also saw that Puerto Ricans not only weren't being offered a peaceful path to independence, but they were forbidden from even saying that they wanted it. And so the Nationalist Party tried revolution, and it didn't go well. In October of 1950, the Puerto Rican Revolution started with a prison break. The next day, shootouts began in 8 Puerto Rican cities. The following day, the United 10 fighter planes and bombed the town of Jayuya. A few hours later, 4 more planes bombed the towns of Utado more thoroughly than they had Jayuya. The 2 towns lay in ruins. This was the first time in the United States had bombed our own citizens, which is a milestone that I'm still disgusted to learn that we've already crossed. And it turns out that this wasn't the last time the United States bombed our own citizens. In 1985, a Pennsylvania state helicopter bombed a house in Philadelphia in response to a shootout. The fire from the bombing burned 61 homes and killed 11 people. And it was 1985. There's video of it, and I put a link to it in the show notes. But our country has been bombing other countries for years using drones, and we've bombed our own country before. I didn't know that. And the pattern that I've witnessed in my adult lifetime has not been towards restraint of bombing powers, but towards allowing it. Right now, we're bombing 7 countries without declarations of war. We're illegally bombing people right now. And so what happens if we're the ones who get in the way of the powerful? If we're the ones that finally get in the way of the corporate interests who are clearly running the world? What makes us think that we're invincible? Because clearly, history tells us we're not. But back to the revolution. At the same time that 2 Puerto Rican towns were being bombed to rubble, 2 Puerto Rican men tried to assassinate President Harry Truman to send a message that the revolution was a war between 2 countries. Now, obviously, they failed. But in the news reports about the attempted assassination, none of the major newspapers mentioned that the hometown, all of these things that I've told you about so far about the way Puerto Ricans had been treated weren't highlighted. Mainland Americans didn't know. We still don't know. And we're still reading those same papers for our information. But regardless, immediately after the revolt, Governor Luis Muñoz Marin declared martial law throughout Puerto Rico. The U.S. military locked down The U.S. military locked down entire towns, blocked roads, and searched cars. FBI agents, police, and National Guardsmen raided thousands of homes and arrested anyone who even knew a nationalist. Within a matter of days, over 3,000 people had been arrested. In prison, the nationalists, also known as U.S. citizens, bright lights shined in their cells 24 hours a day. They were given no sheets, towels, or toilet paper, and no showers were allowed for weeks. Visitors and contact with anyone outside the prisons was prohibited, and the leaders were all placed in solitary confinement. One of the leaders who was thrown in solitary at La Princesa, the prison located within feet of the governor's mansion, was Pedro Albizu Campos, the leader of the Nationalist Party who had already served 11 years on bullshit charges. While in prison in La Princesa, 6 months before his trial, odd light somehow started coming through the concrete walls of his cell, causing him to get a full-body sunburn. These lights continued every day. After a week, he reported that his legs, hands, head, and just about every part of his body was experiencing extreme swelling. But in solitary confinement, he couldn't tell anyone. He sent multiple letters to the prison warden, who just ignored them. And it wasn't just Pedro Albizu Campos who found this out to be true. Other prisoners in La Princesa were reporting the same radiation. At a doctor's suggestion, 2 prisoners were temporarily moved into Albizu Campos' cell, and almost immediately they started complaining of headaches and radiation burns. The warden also switched a second group of prisoners, 51, complaining of electronic rays. In August of 1951, after months of complaining about the radiation burns he was experiencing in his cell, FBI files showed that the government declared him mentally and physically able to stand trial, basically saying, this guy's okay. However, other documents from the same exact time period declared him paranoid and insane. When he complained about being burned by electronic rays. There are also other FBI reports that back up Pedro Albizu Campos' claims. Files sent to J. Edgar Hoover himself acknowledged that Albizu was, quote, physically incapacitated with body swellings, unquote. That he had, quote, fever and pain, high blood pressure, headaches, and swelling on his legs, unquote. And that he was in, quote, such bad health that he can scarcely walk, unquote. Despite all of this, for 5 years, from 1951 to 1956, nothing was done about Albizu Campos' medical condition. The United States kept sending in teams of psychiatrists into his cell, all of whom declared him insane. The United States government was also spying on and trashed independent doctors who were sent to evaluate Albizu Campos. Over and over, he stated that the radiation was intended to induce either a stroke or a heart attack. And he had a stroke in March of 1956, which is what I'm guessing was the point of his torture. Now, it's tough to say for sure that radiation-induced torture is what happened here because after he died, the United States government refused to investigate and refused to allow a radiologist or nuclear physicist to examine Albizu's body. But there are some dots that, when connected, lead to some strong evidence that Albizu Campos was a guinea pig for a mass radiation experiment, and far from the only one. In November of 1986, Congressman, now Senator, Ed Markey of Massachusetts delivered a report to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce titled, quote, American Nuclear Guinea Pigs, 3 decades of radiation experiments on U.S. citizens. This report covered 695 people exposed to radiation in 31 experiments sponsored by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission from the 1940s to the 1970s. The report says that some people participated willingly, but some were, quote, captive audiences, unquote, who did not give consent, such as elderly people, hospital patients with terminal diseases, and prisoners. Here's a quote from the congressional report, quote, during May of 1945 at the Clinton Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 2 groups of 10 subjects were exposed to beta rays to determine the dose that would begin of the skin, unquote. Now let's take note of 2 things there. The date of these experiments was 1945. Pedro Albizu Campos was put in La Princesa prison in 1951, after those experiments were already done in Tennessee. Also, the location. The experiments were conducted in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Well, in February and March of 1951, Dr. Marshall Brewster, the director of the medical division of the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, as in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, well, he visited Puerto Rico. The declassified FBI records for Albizu Campos omit the entire period of doctorate, which coincides exactly with Albizu's first report of radiation in his cell. In a separate U.S. Department of Energy report released in 1995, we also learned that the federal government conducted radiation experiments on up to 20,000 men, women, and children between World War II and the mid-1970s. 435 confirmed experiments used children, mental patients, mentally disabled people, and prison inmates. In many cases, many documented, proven cases, these individuals were exposed to lethal beams of radiation and they died. And just to show you how sick these fuckers were, in one study, 54 mentally disabled children at the Walter E. Fernando School in Waltham, Mass. were told that they were joining a science club and would be given gifts or trips to Red Sox games if they joined. The retarded kids were then fed radioactive materials in their cereal for 10 years from 1946 until 1956. In 1998, MIT and Quaker Oats agreed to pay $1.85 million to the children who were in the science club. And so that actually happened. So if the U.S. government was willing to trick handicapped children into participating in their radiation experiments at that time, is it so far-fetched to think that they could have cooked the experiments at that time? Is it so far-fetched to think that they could have cooked the leader of the Nationalist Party in his cell? The guy who led the labor strike that forced the sugar industry to pay their workers double, costing the industry precious profits? The leader of the party, which was to be destroyed by any means necessary? Even today, there's proof the federal government had anything to do with it. But he sure was silenced, wasn't he? Within 5 years of being locked up in La Princesa, he went from healthy to dead, and there's no blood or fingerprint.